So, welcome everyone. Today I will be giving you an overview over the 2023 DUT Call. So as you can see, we have 27 participating countries this year, and the total national budget that's dedicated to this call is over 65 million euros. So the EC will also support the partnership and its first two calls, which includes this one since it's the second call, with up to 37 million euros. What's important to note is that not every funding agency in every country will also support every research type or every pathway and topic. So it's always very important to check the table 1 of the Annex A in the call text and the information listed for your country or your region, your funding agency basically that's responsible for your organization in the Annex A. So this can be found on the website. Let's look at the timeline next. So as you can see, the call starts at the 1st of September in 2023. Then there's the pre-proposal deadline at the end of November of 2023. And then that is then followed by eligibility checks, as well as obviously the first round of expert panel meetings, which will assess the pre-proposals. Then the invitations for the stage 2 are sent out to those projects which are invited to the stage 2 in February of 2024. And then the next deadline is for the full proposals at the end of April of 2024. That is then also followed by another round of eligibility checks, as well as obviously another expert panel meeting to assess those full proposals, and which then accumulates in the funding recommendation by the call steering committee, and then obviously the funding decisions and the announcements of the results. And the projects are scheduled to start in September of 2024 or January of 2025, depending on the project. So let's now look at who can apply. So there are different kinds of organizations, as you can see on the slide, that can apply. But what's very important to note is that not every funding agency can also fund every kind of organization. So maybe there are some funding agencies that can only maybe, for example, fund research organizations. So it's always very important to check, as I've said, the national annex in the call text, which you can find on the website. There are different kinds of roles in a consortium. So there's, for example, the main applicant, which is the organization responsible for coordinating and managing the project. So what's also very important to note about the main applicants is that the funding decision results and so on are only communicated to the main applicant. So the main applicant has to then forward them to the other applicants and partners in the consortium. Then there are co-applicants, which are applicants other than the main applicant. They're also eligible for funding. And then there's cooperation partners, which maybe participate via LOI or something, and they're not eligible for funding from funding agencies. Then there's the principal investigators, which are the persons that act as lead investigator for either the main or the co-applicant. Then there's different kinds of types of research and also approaches. So there's 3 different kinds of research that can be used in this call. There's strategic urban research and applied urban research, and then there's also urban innovation and implementation. And you can address 1, 2, or all 3 of these research types, and you have to then select one approach, which is either research oriented or innovation oriented. So obviously, probably depending on the research type that you select. That will then also, as you can see in the picture, determine the approach that you select. So then there's also obviously transnational eligibility criteria. So you can see them on the slide, and also in more detail, they're provided in the call text. There's in total, there's 9 of them. So there's the first 5, and then there's the rest of them. What's very important to note, and perhaps the most important thing, as I've mentioned it many times now, is to always note that national or regional rules, so the rules that are applied by your funding agency, may be more restrictive. So it's, again, very, very important to always check the national annex and make sure that you obey all of the funding agency's rules as well. Like I said, so there's national and regional eligibility conditions which can inform your consortium. So these could be either, type of eligible partners, or also maybe which expenses are accepted, or also which topics can be funded, or which types of research and innovation activities are even supported. Or even, and this is also very important, that you have to submit the application not only on a transnational level, but also again on the national level, or maybe even different kinds of deadlines that are on the national level. So yeah, it's very, very important to always check the national annex and scroll through and find your agency. And also probably, or definitely important, is to check maybe the other agencies that are involved in your consortium, just to make sure that your consortium is applicable or is eligible on all levels and not just on your own countries or regions level. And if there are any questions or anything, or inquiries about specific rules, it's always very important to also get in touch with those agencies. And there are also always contact points listed also in the national annex. And for some funding agencies, as it says in the slide, it's even mandatory to have this contact first. So it's probably better to be safe than sorry and contact them. Yes, so there are different kinds of transnational criteria listed here that could be maybe applied by some agencies, and these are fictional, but and just meant to give you an example of what could be, what could be applicable. But yeah, so you see that maybe we have like a country A which has to include a company, and can only fund research organizations, universities, and companies, and maybe not municipalities. And we have country B, which maybe has to have at least 2 municipalities in the consortium, and they also have a deadline where the national application must be submitted by a certain date, so maybe January 10th. So that's also important to not forget. Then there's country C, where municipalities are not eligible for funding. So, there could maybe be a bit of a problem with country B and country C, since they both need municipalities. But then, it would either have to be, if this municipality is from country C, it would have to be a cooperation partner, or it could be from the other countries and just not funded by country C. But you see that there's sometimes maybe situations where questions could arise. So it's always very, very important to read all of the information in the national annex carefully. And if there are any questions, contact your national agencies or regional agencies, which are responsible for your consortium and your organizations. And then there's country D, where maybe only one person may be nominated as PI in one proposal. So, there's different kinds of rules that can be applicable. And so we have on the next slide a fictional example for a project consortia, and you can see that there's different kinds of organizations from different kinds of countries with different kinds of PIs and so on. So, and there are different partner types. So we have two cooperation partners in this fictional consortium. So, it would be very important to make sure that all of the partners here are eligible on the national level as well, not just on a transnational level, but also on a transnational level. So it's always important to make sure that your consortium, one, obeys all of the transnational rules, but two, also is also eligible on all the national levels. Otherwise, maybe you could lose one of the partners because the funding agencies say that they're not eligible, and then maybe what could then happen is that it isn't eligible on the transnational level anymore, because maybe you have too few countries now, since there has to be a certain number of countries. So it's always the bottom line is that it's always very important to, one, check the transnational rules, but also always check the national annexes and check with the funding agencies of all the countries involved in your consortium, and or regions or countries, depending on what the funding agencies are responsible for. Okay, let's now look at the evaluation and selection process. So I've mentioned it during the timeline. So there's 2 stages. There's first a pre-proposal, and then later on the full detailed proposal. So stage 1 and stage 2. And both stages are evaluated by an international independent expert panels. And the evaluation of the expert panel will then result in ranking lists, which correspond to a specific transition pathway and a specific research or innovation-oriented approach. So as you can see in the table, that there are 6 different ranking lists in total. So 1 for each pathway, we have 3, and 1 for each approach. And then of the ranking list, from the ranking lists, the projects are based on the ranking lists are selected by the call steering committee and then suggested for funding. And not only on the ranking list, but obviously also on depending on the national and regional budgets and so on. Crucial for your proposal is therefore that you choose the most relevant transition pathway and also the best research approach that fits your project. So either research oriented or innovation oriented. So it's very important to always make sure to choose the best fitting choice on each level. Then there's certain evaluation criteria that will be looked at by the expert panels. So there's 3. There's excellence and intellectual merit. Then there's impact and user engagement, and there's quality and efficiency of project implementations. And each criteria will be scored with evaluation scores, and then that there are also obviously sub criteria, which we will address in the next slides. And what's important to note is that some sub criteria will not be assessed in the first stage because it's only a very short pre-proposal where maybe it's not clear, or there's not information to really accurately assess these criteria. So these are noted in italics because they will only be assessed in the second stage. And then there's also obviously some sub-criteria which are specific to either the research-oriented or the innovation-oriented approach. So first, you can see here the sub-criteria for excellence and intellectual merit, where you can see that the first 3 are assessed in both slides, and then you have the bottom 2, which are only assessed in the second stage, and then obviously at the bottom you see that there's per each innovation or research-oriented approach, you have 1 sub-criteria that only applies depending on which approach your project applies to. Here you can see the evaluation sub-criteria for impact and user engagement. Also, again, noted in italics, only the ones that are only assessed in stage 2. So here you can see that both sub-criteria that are specific to the approach are only assessed in stage 2. And then lastly, the evaluation sub-criteria for quality and efficiency. Again, here you can see we don't have any approach-specific sub-criteria, but we have quite a few that are only looked at in stage 2. So yeah, even when writing your proposal, it's important to also look at these criteria. So the bottom line, to sum up, is that it's very, very important to always make sure you check your national annex and you get in touch with your funding agencies, and you look at all the rules, both on the transnational and the national level, and not just the transnational level, because that way, you run into the risk of not being eligible for funding from your responsible agency. So thank you, everyone, and I wish you a very productive call.